All right, good evening, Cherokee Creek. Oh, welcome in. Good to see y'all out there. All these folks, many of you got a belly full of soup or something from over there tonight, and I'm looking forward to mine tomorrow. As I tell folks, it's hard for me to eat before I preach, because if y'all only get 3-minute sermons, you'd probably want that every week, and I have to eat that much more every time, so I save mine as a general rule to the next day, but I'm looking forward to some salmon stew and that tomorrow. A few things happening. The children signed up to go snow tubing on Saturday. They're leaving at 11, so see Jessica if you have any questions about that. A week from Saturday is the children's volunteer training from 10 to 2. Same thing. See Jessica if you have any questions about that. Also, around the corner, the Jordan St. Cyr concert on February the 9th at 7. You can get tickets through the church or online. We're going to plan on having baptism on February the 2nd and a Costa Rica meeting on February the 9th as well. So a few things happening, and of course don't forget about Operation Christmas Child. One more Sunday for this month, and you can bring in the small baby dolls, stuffed animals, and then we'll dive into a new month and see if we can beat our goal from last time, right? So don't forget about those things coming up. All right, if you have your Bible, we are Judges chapter 8. We've been going through the life of Gideon for a while now, I guess about 3 months, 4 months or so, something like that. And we're going to see the conclusion of that tonight, but I'm really trying to figure out if we want to talk a little bit about the next chapter too, and we'll see next week. You'll find out next week if we decide to do that or not. But Judges 8 is where we're going to be here in a moment. There was a gallery owner that was telling one of his artists he had got some good news and some bad news. And many of us can relate to having someone talk to us about good and or bad news, and some at the same time. So the artist asked for the good news first. And so the owner of the gallery said, well, the good news is a man came in here today asking if the price of your paintings would go up after you died. And when I told him they would, he bought every single one of your paintings. And the artist was just elated. He said, what could possibly be the bad news? And he said, well, I'm pretty sure he was your doctor. So anyway, the phrase that keeps coming to mind as we think of Gideon right at the end is the good, the bad, the ugly, right? There's good news, there's bad news, there's some not even worse than that. And we really see that here in the end if we look at what happens here right at the end of his life. Now, I do want you to understand from what we've been talking about, where we left off even last time with the ephod that was made and them worshiping, in essence, that ephod. And we go from there into verse 29. There's years that pass, okay? We don't always think about that or see that. It talked about, verse 28, the country was quiet for 40 years in the days of Gideon. Well, there's a lot of those years that are going by and passing when we get into verse 29. And so listen as I read through the end of the chapter, these few verses tonight. Then Jerubbaal, the son of Joash, went and dwelt in his own house. Gideon had 70 sons who were his own offspring, for he had many wives, and his concubine, who was in Shechem, also bore him a son, whose name he called Abimelech. Now Gideon, the son of Joash, died at a good old age and was buried in the tomb of Joash his father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. So it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. Thus the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side, nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal, Gideon, that is, in accordance with the good he had done for Israel. And again, a lot of time passes, and this kind of summarizes a little bit of Gideon's life and then right at the end. And so let's think of a few things. There is a long life and a big family that's mentioned in these first few verses. Jerubbaal, that's it. I say it Jerubbaal, but anyway, that is Gideon. And that name, going back just a couple chapters back, we saw in chapter 6, verse 32, where that name is kind of given after he tears down all those images of Baal, and so that's what they call him, which means let Baal contend, or let Baal plead on his own behalf is the idea. And so that's a name that's given for Gideon. And so he goes and he dwells in his own house. And so many see this, and then they see what it comes after. He had 70 sons, his offspring, had many wives. His concubine who was in Shechem bore him a son named Abimelech. It's interesting, that's the only one mentioned by name. It says his concubine there. There may have been others, but the one in Shechem bore him this son. It's the only one mentioned by name, and if you look at chapter 9, you'll see that name. And what's to follow, we may talk about next week. But it tells us that he died a good old age. That's the same phrase we talked about Sunday in the sense of gray hairs. He was buried in the tomb of Joash's father in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. Now, that doesn't sound horrible, other than we would look at that and say, probably shouldn't have many wives. Probably shouldn't have concubines, right? But the idea of the large family, the Lord's blessed with all these children, only one mentioned by name. But what we don't always think about there is, the years and the time that passes. So some look at this and they'll say, he went and dwelt in his own house. He has all these relationships, all this family that comes after him. And so there are many scholars that would say, although we talked last week how he did not accept being the king when they wanted to make him a king, maybe he did kind of live a little bit like one, though. Because he went to his own house and he just kind of chilled. He kind of had it made because of everything that had happened. The people obviously took care of him. His family took care of him. Everything was handed there. And then he names this one son Abimelech, and that may sound like not a big deal, but that means my father is king. Interesting. And it's interesting what we find out later about Abimelech, and I mentioned last week, that's the one that had a little different view about being king than maybe Gideon did. But at the same time, maybe Gideon did kind of buy into this a little bit, and maybe he did live his life a little bit that way. But he lived a long time. I tried to find roughly how old he was when he died, and I couldn't really find anybody that gave a number to it. But it's at a good old age, and he's buried and so forth. So he has a long life. He has a big family. There's peace during those 40 years that come after, and so the Lord has been good in all sorts of ways. In the midst of even his struggles, just like God's good in the midst of our struggles. You agree with that? He is. We don't do everything right either, so God's still good and faithful. I read also, this was interesting, came across this little note. At 3,100 plus years ago now, archaeologists in southern Israel found this old fragment of a jug with 5 letters written in ink that appear to represent the name Jerubbaal, or Gideon in essence. And so it just kind of documents a little of the story and what happened, and they found some evidence of that. There was a pastor and his wife. They were driving to visit grandparents with their children, and their little daughter Rachel asked the inevitable question, "Are we there yet? How much longer?" Y'all know what that is. And so the father said, "No, we're still 150 miles away." And so the little girl, being pretty sharp, she said, "Well, how long is that?" And so the father said, "Well, it's about 3 more hours." Some of you, I know it wouldn't take you that long, okay? But for him, he's a pastor, all right? About 3 hours. And so the little girl didn't say anything for a little bit, but she's thinking about 3 hours. What is that? And so she leaned forward from the back seat, making sure Mommy could hear. Again, Daddy's preacher, Mama's preacher's wife. She said, "Mommy, is that as long as one of Daddy's sermons?" And I don't have the answer Mommy gave, but it's probably what some of you are thinking. No, it just feels like it, right? That kind of thing. So long life. Gideon has, and there's good things that come, but that last large number of years that we have of his life is summarized in those few verses. And it makes us think how our life is often summarized by a dash, right, on that tombstone. So anyway, the good in many ways is there, but there's also a little bit of bad. There's also the idea of what he names his son and what we will see transpire with that and through that. But then it kind of takes even a worse turn in these next few verses. And the thought is a short memory they have towards God. It says, so it was, as soon as Gideon was dead, the children of Israel again played the harlot with the Baals and made Baal-berith their god. And the children of Israel did not remember the Lord their God, who had delivered them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. That's not good. That's not the legacy that Gideon, I'm sure, wanted to leave or expected to leave, that sort of thing. But as soon as he's dead, I mean, the language almost indicates they're waiting. They're just waiting on him to die. And then they play the harlot. If you remember, we see that phrase in verse 27 when it came to that ephod, that they played the harlot there as well. It became a snare to Gideon and his family. And that language is important. It's significant. It paints a picture we may not want to think about, but it also paints this picture of how God and his relationship with us, how he uses marriage to talk about that. You know, he's the groom, the church is the bride, there's this beautiful marriage. And then, of course, the idea in New Testament times when we think about the church is when we go away from that, it's like committing adultery, it's like committing fornication. And that's what the word means, that they're committing these things spiritually with the Baals. They're turning away from God toward them. And it goes all the way back to when, Gideon's leading them out of this. He tears down all those Baals, all the shrines, all that sort of stuff. And then immediately, once he's gone, they're right back at it. But I want you to know, I had this thought, it wasn't that big of a jump. You say, what do you mean? Well, remember last week, the ephod? He made that golden ephod, and they're worshiping there with that ephod. Instead of God himself, they're already turning their hearts toward idolatry and worship. And now it's been going on really for years and years and years and years and years. So it wasn't as big a jump as it looks like, where once he's dead, they go and do this. They're really making their way there all the way through. And then once he's gone, then they're just all in. And they're playing the harlot. They make Baal-berith their god. Baal-berith means Lord of the Covenant, the God of the Philistines, and so forth. The Baals are worshipped in Canaanite culture and Phoenician culture, the male divinity, the supreme one that they would have, and so they immediately make them gods again to worship. And they just didn't remember the Lord their God. Now, the word remember, it means obviously what we would think. They didn't recall, they didn't think about him. It also has the idea they didn't even mention him. Isn't that interesting? They didn't even mention him. Meaning what? I think it has the idea of this. When they would start thinking about credit for what had happened and how far they had come, it probably went away from Yahweh, the Lord God Almighty himself, and it might have went toward that ephod, or it went toward something else, where they didn't mention God. They mentioned other things which had already started taking the place of God. And so he's just an afterthought at best to them. Although he had delivered them, saved and rescued them from the hands of their enemies on every single side. So in front, behind, right, left, and all the other angles in between, God has delivered them, and yet he has been forgotten in a period of quiet and peace. So think about in our lives and what we see sometimes happen, and when things are good, things are calm, if we're not careful, we take things for granted. We kind of overlook certain things, and If we're not careful, we just kind of go through motions as if God's not even there. And that's really what they were doing, but it was a little more maybe intentional than sometimes we think about because of where their worship was starting to go and where they were focusing their attention. But they have a very short memory toward God himself, and it causes all sorts of problems. Again, it was not just a quick jump. Gideon dies, there it is. This happens over years, and that's the way it is with sin. And that's the way it is with our slide and our downfalls we talked about last time, and that slip and slide is that we just, next thing you know, it just, over time, we're just sliding and sliding and sliding. And it gets us there. Y'all have heard a version of this story, I'm sure. But in this case, the man was working in his backyard one day, and his neighbor is talking to him over the fence. And he said, "Hey, man, yeah, my wife and I, we went to one of those seminars yesterday where, they teach you ways to improve your memory and such." Said, "It was awesome. It was wonderful." And he's telling about it. He said, "Really, what was the name of it?" And here's the part y'all will remember if you know this story. The man said, "Oh, what's the name of that flower that smells so good and has thorns?" "Oh, you mean a rose?" "Yeah. Hey, Rose, what was the name of that seminar we went to yesterday?" Y'all remember that one, right? Surely, there's just a million versions of the same story. But nevertheless, they were like, "Hey, Joseph, what's the name of that God? What's the name of that one that delivered us? Who did that?" And over time, Yahweh is just moved to the side. We see it happen in countries, even like our own, in ways. We see it happen in other places around the world where he's just, at best, an afterthought. And so a lot happens in these 40 years, if that, to get them to this place. But then there's also little or no respect toward Gideon. It says, "Nor did they show kindness to the house of Jerubbaal," Gideon, "in accordance with the good he had done for Israel." So they didn't give the respect that was needed or should have been maybe deserved because of what had happened. A couple of statements. Somebody said, "The respect of those you respect is worth more than the applause of the multitude." So if you respect and get respect from those that you do respect, that's pretty good. Someone said, "There was no respect for youth when I was young, and now that I'm old, there's no respect for the aged. I missed it coming and going." Some probably feel that way, even here. They did not show him kindness. It's the word that's often translated mercy, loving kindness. They didn't show him goodness in a way. I think that, again, was much like the time. It just kind of more and more through the years is the way that went. Idea of him being at his home, the idea of him, for some, maybe living a life of a king to a degree, but over time it seems to fade to where they just don't show any kindness, almost any attention, any respect whatsoever to him, although he did so much good. The word good was also really the same word used in verse 32 in the sense of being merry, being prosperous, all of those things. He said they just didn't show any of that toward him and his family at the end. And then, of course, once he's gone there, they just dismiss it, just almost wash their hands of him as if it's just completely over and there's nothing more that they can do. Somebody made the statement, "How soon the sinful hearts of humans forget both the Lord and the people who have served them faithfully." And we think about it as a nation. We have special holidays. We remember folks with our nation and those who have served, and we want to give honor where honor is due in that regard. And it's important to remember, and I think that's vital. But obviously we remember the Lord and who he is and what he's done for us, and that's vitally important. I don't know how many of you guys read the Stand Firm magazine or a little devotional that we have here. Yesterday, there was a really neat story, and I think it goes really well with what we're talking about. And as we kind of wrap up a little bit of Gideon's life here, because Gideon's life comes to a close, and then the people of Israel go the opposite way, the wrong way. It doesn't have to be like that. God uses life, and He can use death. He can use it in a positive way if we so allow. And so this was part of that devotion from yesterday. A man named David was a strong believer who was determined to go to Africa and make disciples among an unreached tribe. He was noticeably confident as he began to put a team together, and they planned their approach. They started by boldly announcing to churches that their plan was to disciple 5 villagers each and then train them to disciple 5 others. Sounds like a great plan, right? Great plan. This simple plan of multiplication seemed as though it would be effective. The problem, however, was not the plan, but where their strength was found. They were confident in their own abilities, which meant they were not dependent upon the Lord. It was not long before their plans to win and disciple the natives failed miserably, and they began searching for answers. As they cried out to God for the people group they were beginning to love, God opened a door, but it was a really unusual door. A woman died in her hut in a local village. And though her hut was a tremendously valuable resource, the tribe would not touch a dead body. So when the missionaries discovered this, they volunteered to take the body and bury it and show proper respect. Well, this caused the chief to ask questions about death, which caused him to ask questions about all sorts of things, which eventually led to the salvation of the chief and more than 150 villagers. And out of that, 9 men from those who were converted asked to be trained immediately as pastors and leaders so they could go and start churches and tell others as well. Isn't it amazing what God can use for His glory? In life and in death. It's what we were talking about Sunday night, and we'll talk about again some more on Sunday. For me to live as Christ, Paul says, to die is gain. God can use us in our life on good days and even not so good days, but He can still use us. But He can also use us when our time comes to a close, like Gideon's did. But sadly, the ugly part is when they just start going completely away from God. But I've seen occasions where it comes to the end of a life and a family starts thinking about that loved one, and they think about faith, and they think about how God had transformed their life, and they want that more for them and their own children or their extended family, whatever the case might be. And I've seen God take those times and those moments and just completely turn it around. And I hope and pray He continues to do that in all sorts of ways and all sorts of opportunities that we may find ourselves with. But we get to the end of Gideon's life, and I think we certainly see the good, the bad, and the ugly. I wish I could say it gets better if we decide to dive into chapter 9, but it doesn't get better, because Abimelech comes onto the scene, and we'll see maybe if we get there next week, kind of what continues from that point on in the book of Judges. But let me lead us in prayer, and we'll close our time tonight. Father, thank You for our blessing today. I do thank You so much for the time You've given us, not only tonight, but in these weeks to study through Gideon's life. And Lord, it is quite revealing and quite telling. And Lord, I thank You for how You used him in such an incredible way with just those 300 to gain victory over thousands upon thousands and thousands. And Lord, to remind us that You'll do that in us and through us and for us if we'll submit and we'll say, Lord, You are first, and You can do the impossible. The impossible is quite common for You. And so, Lord, I thank You for that, and I pray that You would do amazing things in our lives even tonight as we just do a little evaluation of who we are and what You are doing, what You want us to do, how we can be effective and more so in the days to come. And Lord, how You are so good at taking things from us and using those things in such a beautiful and a positive way. And so, Lord, may our lives, and even as it comes close to the end for some, maybe even in our deaths, that you would use those things to point people to Jesus. In his name we pray. Amen.